So hello, my name's Diana Kirk from the University of Auckland, and the area of the talk this afternoon is on software development methodologies. I was originally scheduled for tomorrow, so this area of talk might not be directly of interest to some of you, but I hope you'll get some value from it anyway. So then the talk is Exploring Task Equivalence for Software Engineering, Adaptation and Replacement. And some background for the talk. So the talk's about software development methodologies. There have been many, many studies on software development methodologies, and most of them have been really to do with how to fit bits of Agile and bits of traditional methodologies together. How do you adapt Agile for various contexts? How do you combine bits of Agile and traditional? And until now, most of these studies have been at the level of the methodology. So they've looked at Scrum or XP or something like that and been around that. And the driver of this work has really been the complexity of the development environment. In most cases, or in many cases, probably most actually, there is some disconnect or lack of fit between the methodology selected by a company and some aspects of the project. So more recent studies, or not more recent, lots of studies again, have shown that this ad hoc adaptation, trying to fit bits together or change things in an ad hoc way, is likely to cause issues with efficacy. Something goes wrong, which we didn't realize was going to happen before we started. And studies are also beginning to move towards looking at the practice rather than the methodology as a whole. Okay. So the motivation for this work: practices are often adapted, selected in an inappropriate way. There's an ad hoc approach taken to practice adaptation based on no evidence. There's hardly any evidence out there about any of this stuff. And furthermore, the architected methodologies actually require that you implement all the practices in a methodology. You can't change pair programming or swap it out by doing side-by-side development, because one of the aims of pair programming is that one developer is checking code as the other one's typing. And so, if you change things, then you're going to miss out on that. So the long-term vision of this research is to support practitioners with adapting practices to suit local context in an effective and evidence-based way. And we have a long way to go. So we'll start off, starting point is the software development process, I guess, as stated by Basile and Rombach. Sound tailoring requires the ability to characterize goals, the environment, and the effect of methods and tools on achieving these goals in a particular environment. So this is from 1987, a long time ago. But there are three ideas: goals, environment, and the methods and tools. And so kind of from this, or based on this, my definition for practice is an activity involving people and or technology that has a specific objective and is carried out within a specific environment. And the research question is, can we identify some inherent characteristics of a practice that would enable us to alter or replace a practice or combine practices? So rather than talking about Agile and traditional, is there something more basic about the practice that we can use to talk about these things kind of like on an equal basis? And the vision is that if practices are equivalent with respect to some key characteristics, can be substituted according to project context. So the research lies in the exploratory place. We're coming up with a model because we're not happy with what's there at the moment. We don't understand it. There's not enough evidence. It's uncharted territory. And from this research, we hope to get a first model, which will then go through more formal refinement. And eventually, once we're happy that the model is useful, then we can use it to start asking questions, base hypotheses, and begin to gather some evidence a long way down track. So some of the thoughts behind this research, or some of the inspiration, came from Pentland. In the field of information technology, Pentland noted that people and artifacts are becoming increasingly intertwined. And he addressed this by a focus on actions, and he represented actions by a grammar. So different kinds of actions were different parts of the grammar, and then you could have rules for combination. And I see parallels with software engineering. There's a disconnect between traditional and agile people-centric approaches. Can we kind of use this idea of a practice grammar to somehow, get over this disconnect and talk about them on an equal plane? So the approach for this study was to go to the literature to get, for practice now my definition is kind of like a task. So we're going to look at tasks and practices in literature to see how other people have characterized them. Now it was really important because we don't want to get stuck in the software engineering lens because that's very limited. If we're talking about tasks and practices in general, we wanted to make sure that we gathered information from different disciplines. And then for each of these, we made some argument about the relevance for practice equivalence, and then as a final proof of concept, characterized some common practices. So this is some of the terms that came out from the literature. On the left are the terms that we found. So things like production, non-routine, clearly ill-defined, tacit explicit knowledge, tinkerable, function. And the third column are the different disciplines. So we found some in psychology, management, software engineering, and maths. And on the next column, examples, there are some of the examples that were given. So for example, some production examples were to produce ideas or images. In the fifth row, clearly ill-defined, criterion unclear, information missing. A couple of down, tacit explicit knowledge. Is the knowledge easily codified or is it subjective? And so on and so forth. And so the first job, these kind of, to me anyway, clearly fell into three different ideas. Some described objectives. So produce ideas, images, that's the objective of the task. Some described were more at the activity level, so not clearly specified, criterion unclear, information missing, and activity. And the one that was tacit explicit actually related to knowledge, something to do with the knowledge that was being manipulated by the task. So the argument is that for equivalence for practice, we must consider what equivalence means with respect to objective, activity, and knowledge. So this table here is a repeat of the table above, just for the rows with objective. And the argument here is that an objective is generally stated as carry out an action on an item. So in the fourth column, we have some of these examples, and in the red were the actions: produce, provide instructions, transform, list. And in purple are the things that were being acted on: images, ideas, problems, requirements, defects. And the question is, can we extract a core set of base actions that would support equivalence? For example, producing ideas and resolving defects are somehow creating something. Providing instructions and sharing tacit knowledge, well, we can maybe perceive these as being informing. And so, for example, a practice to create a design clearly cannot be replaced by one that evaluates a design. Two different actions. Can we use the functional area to support equivalence of items? So, for example, user stories and requirement specifications all belong to this scoping function. Code and unit tests belong to implementation function. And again, clearly, you can't replace a practice within the scoping function with one within the release function. So for this first pass of this framework, for equivalence of objectives, we require that practices are the same action. And these are the actions that we have taken from the work before: explore, create, evaluate, transform, deliver, approve, and inform. And the functions have come from some earlier work I did with you in Temporal way 10 years ago, where we talked to New Zealand companies and tried to find out how come they were being successful despite the fact that they didn't follow any of the larger scale recommendations for process improvement, and in fact didn't really understand what they meant, we found. And one way we found of talking in a way that that people understood was to look at the different functional categories. So we have road mapping, scope, architect, implement, integrate, release, and support. And this is our first pass for the for equivalence for the functions. We did the same with activity. Can we identify a core set of base characteristics support equivalence for a task activity? So these are some of the terms from the table before, just relating to activity. And I've just grouped them according to some, ideas that they seem to group by. So analytical, routine, and investigative or reasoning all seem to talk about somehow the degree of reasoning required by the task. Do you need to reason a lot or not much? The next four related, we categorized as relating to creativity. Is the task clearly or ill-defined? Is it open or closed? Is it evidence-based or tinkerable? Is it meant to be used for creativity or not? And the last one, interactive, this came out, perspectives, this came out because it came clear that for some tasks, it's actually inherent in the task that roles from different functions need to be there. You can't define or elicit requirements unless you have both a representation with from the engineer perspective and from the client perspective. So different functions are needed for that task. Something like pair programming assumes you've got two peers, two people from the same, with the same perspective in the task. And then of course there would be some single. So the last one was the knowledge. So we started off with this idea of tacit versus explicit knowledge. So tacit knowledge is difficult to articulate, and it's usually transferred in social situations. And explicit is codified, usually documented. And this seemed really relevant because it kind of, we thought, in some ways captures the, this disconnect with agile and traditional. But it's not straightforward because one of the complaints about waterfall was that the analyst gained some tacit knowledge by speaking to the customer, and that tacit knowledge was lost in the pipeline because the analyst didn't then talk to the developers who talked further down, but rather did it by documentation. Tacit knowledge was lost. So realized at some point that both traditional and agile methodologies have both tacit and explicit knowledge. So that term wasn't really quite right. So we had to find new terms, and we've ended up with hard and soft. Not quite happy about them, but that'll do for the moment. And the other thing, of course, is it's not the knowledge within the task that matters. In fact, that might be something that we want to be different. It might be that we want to be able to replace a task that's based on that's implemented with documentation by a task that's implemented by using the knowledge in people's heads. But it matters at the interface. If you have a task that produces soft knowledge, i.e. in somebody's head, you cannot then have a downstream task that expects standards documentation. And this is a problem that has happened in some of the early attempts at helping industry to do agile stuff. Oops. So the framework for task knowledge equivalence requires that a practice has the same interface profile as its upstream downstream practice with respect to whether the knowledge is hard or soft in people's heads. So this is the first pass at the framework. For equivalence, we must look at the objective in terms of the actions and the functional area. And for activity, we must look at the level of creativity, reasoning, and perspectives required by the task, and the interface knowledge. And note that this is not this is just, you know, a characteristic of the task itself, not how it was implemented. So the proof of concept, I tried to take a whole bunch of practices from somewhere, I can't remember where, and put them into here. And of course, one of the first real problems that came up was things are so badly defined in software that I didn't even know what some of the things meant before deciding where they went. So for example, if you look at something coding standards in the inform column in the implementation row, does that mean creating new coding standards? Or does it mean using coding standards? They're two entirely different practices. But you can see that, so I've got the practices and I've taken some of the other categories. So we've looked at the perspective, that's the first letter inside the bracket. Does it require multiple function perspective, more than one peer or single? And the last two are the interface knowledge, hard and soft. So in scope create, the top left one, backlog management and formal specification both require hard in and hard out, cool. But the first requires functions. It requires, again, client input, whereas formal specification requires peers. Use case modeling and user stories from this model appear to be compatible and therefore replaceable. I probably won't talk to the others just for time. But integrate, evaluate, destructive testing and security testing look kind of similar, maybe, okay. Okay. But most of you will have been looking at that chart thinking, but what about, we're not there yet, okay? So for example, I had create module code and create unit tests in the same cell in that table. They're clearly not the same thing. You clearly can't replace one by the other. So what's wrong here? What can we do? Perhaps do we need to extend the framework? For example, we can say, carry out an action on an item to address a specific outcome. So we have an extra part of the characterization. Or can we differentiate by the creativity or reasoning profile? Can we say that unit tests require less creativity than coding because the specifications are there and the code's there? I don't know. Another example of this is I had destructive and security testing in the same cell. Clearly they're not the same thing and can't be substituted. So again, can we think about extending the framework to address the outcome? Destructive testing is evaluate the product to find points of failure. Security testing, evaluate the product to assess security. Perhaps that's a way forward. Another example of our not there yet is pair programming versus coding in parallel. So these both came up as similar in the table I had above. But they're not the same. We've just discussed the fact that you cannot replace one by the other because you lose that kind of evaluation aspect of pair programming. Perhaps the rule is that all of the cells must be the same. So pair programming appeared in 3 cells, whereas coding in parallel appeared in only 1. So by that definition, they're not the same thing. Or can we differentiate by the perspectives profile? But that doesn't work because of, it doesn't work when we think about collaborative programming. In the meantime, the first thing this work has done is to help to really consider what we mean by a practice. We say pair programming, I'm using this as an example because most people know about it, But what does that mean? If you do pair programming with one very senior engineer and one junior engineer, where one of the manager's goals is a mentoring one, okay, is that the same practice as pair programming with two equal peers who are going to be working together? I don't think it is. It's a completely different practice. In the one case, the junior engineer is not going to be evaluating the senior engineer's work. So it's not an evaluation thing, it's a mentoring thing. In the other case, there's no mentoring, but there's evaluation. Another example is, if you end up discussing scope in a daily stand-up, does this change the practice in an essential way? Well, I think it does, okay? So for me, we haven't got a good way of talking about, this is an attempt to find a good way to talk about practices that removes a lot of these ambiguities and uncertainties and gives us a language to talk about them in a kind of, way that, and this also gives us a way to investigate and explore a practice's people requirements. Do we understand how much creativity is required for certain practices? Maybe we haven't looked into it, perhaps because we haven't got a good definition for practice to start with. So the summary, created a framework that they positioned as being a way to support practice tailoring. We have an initial framework, but there's a lot of work to be done before we've got the framework in to a place where I think it would be anywhere near ready for evidence gathering. But that's the vision, that we can actually do proper evidence gathering based on something defined and specific, because you can't gather evidence with using terms that are, not clear. And when consolidated, the hope is that the framework will support practitioners to modify practices in an evidence-based way and to support researchers to investigating relationships between practice and context. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. I'm going to invite questions from the audience. Danny, if you could please, I was going to say summarise the questions for the online audience and keep your microphone on. That should be okay. I think. Good.
Or I can give you...
or you can use the microphone, I can go around. Okay, well then in that case you'll have to stand next to that microphone there if you don't mind. Good. Okay. Good. I shan't. I was going to say I'll start off with the first question, but instead I'll pass on to you. Hello. Thank you.
Looking for a question.
Thanks.
Okay. I very much like where you're going with this. And as you've observed, it's not there yet. I wonder whether you have thought about its potential for evaluating the completeness of a practice.
Evaluating
the completeness of a practice, that is an organization presents to you its methodology, and then you analyze it in this way, and then compare that to some model of either completeness or of minimal requirements in order to achieve the objective. And that's a different objective from the evolutionary objective that you were talking about, but it strikes me that there's potential here also.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question, because yes, indeed. If I go back to... so if you look at the functional categories, I'm just trying to think the best... Each of these categories has to be represented by some practices in a person's methodology. So if any of them are missing, you haven't got a complete practice. So if something's missing, say within the evaluate scope cell, then that's that's a missing part. I'm not explaining this off the well because it's a while since I've thought about this and I've forgotten what the thinking was. But certainly I would say that, once you've got this framework, you can see where bits are missing. You can see if someone hasn't done the evaluate this or the create this or whatever.
Yeah, I'm hearing a coverage argument there. And then as a follow-up, as you've observed, there's a great deal of tacit knowledge, and it's very hard to extricate that. So that I see as a challenge. And coupling that to my previous question, I could imagine that you look at a methodology where the initial analysis shows lack of coverage, but that on further investigation of the actual practices, you find implicit knowledge about the practices that if you make it part of the analysis, if you make it explicit in that way. And I guess my underlying question is how hard is it really to find the tacit knowledge that's required to show that the methodology is sufficiently good?
Yeah, and to be honest, I think it probably is not possible to be really sure that you've understood all of the tacit knowledge, because tacit knowledge is by definition difficult to codify. So it would seem to me that the only way to be sure that it was covered was to have everybody, including the customer, there all of the time, even more than in XP or Agile. And I don't see that that's possible. So that might be I don't know how to answer that question. Yeah.
Well, I wish you the best with figuring it out, because I like where this is going. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I should say we're inviting online questions. We did actually miss an online question from the previous talk. Sorry, online people, but if you have any online questions for this talk, do type them in and we will read them out. Here's a question from Ole. Hello, thank you.
Thank you. Just a small comment on tactic knowledge. When we do software projects, we often use anthropologists to find out about tactic knowledge by doing field studies.
By doing?
Field studies.
Right, yeah.
For instance, when implementing a system at a hospital, you can talk to the management or the nurses or the doctors, and they tell you whatever they think is important, but not whatever is tactic.
Yeah.
Tacit, sorry for my English.
Yeah.
But then we use anthropologists to follow them for several weeks.
Right.
And they come up with field reports.
Right, okay.
Used in workshops, etc., that point out things that they are doing, but have not really talked about because they're not aware about it.
Okay.
So from our point of view, this has been very, very effective.
Okay. So when you uncover the tacit knowledge, what do you do with it? Is it then understood in people's heads, or do you manage to codify it?
Well, it's hard to codify.
Yeah, yes.
But the essential thing is that it's part of this thing called user involvement or participatory design, right, where you have end users involved in your project from the beginning to the end. Yeah. You carry out field studies, you do workshops. Yeah. When you have prototypes, they bring them back, and the anthropologists study how are the prototypes used, and are there any problems with it, etc., etc. So it's a small element in this larger thing on user involvement, which we think is very effective.
Yeah. Okay. So my only comment on that would be, that's great if you've really got a client who's there all the time,
sure,
and not an analyst who's a replacement client, sure. Because can you be sure that the analyst has the same tacit knowledge as the client?
Yeah.
And how many projects actually can have a small number of clients there all the time? So it might, yeah.
But I think,
I don't know,
some organizations and others are learning that this is an effective way of developing a system that works from the beginning, instead of developing something which you have to change afterwards.
Yeah. So I guess it would work if there's a small number of clients.
Yeah.
But what happens if you're putting something out to like a vertical market, and you've got heaps of clients? One place I worked, the problem was we had clients in disparate, and they didn't agree with what they wanted, the features, never mind the tacit knowledge. So again, some things work
Yeah.
in some circumstances, but
It
not
doesn't
all.
solve all problems, but
Yeah,
we did a project like that for this Maersk shipping system of Denmark
Right.
that has offices all over the world.
Okay.
And these field studies were made at 4 or 5 of the international offices.
Okay.
But it's complicated.
Yeah, I might
Sorry.
talk more about that.
Thank you. Good. Let's thank our speaker one last time.